The year was 1941, and the North Atlantic was not a sea. It was a graveyard. The air was thick with the smell of oil and salt, a cold that bit through wool and leather, and a tension so heavy it felt like it could snap the hulls of the ships patrolling its gray, mountainous waves. In the center of this nightmare stood a singular entity that defied human logic, the German battleship Bismarck. To understand why the British were terrified, you have to understand that the Bismarck was not just a ship, it was a statement. It was 823 feet of predatory engineering, a floating fortress wrapped in 13 inches of Krupp cemented armor that was thought to be impenetrable by any shell in the British inventory. Adolf Hitler had personally obsessed over its construction, viewing it as the physical manifestation of German superiority. It was armed with 8 15-inch guns housed in 4 massive turrets, Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora, capable of hurling a 1,700-pound shell over the horizon with the precision of a sniper's rifle. The Bismarck was the ultimate apex predator, and in May of 1941, it broke cover and headed for the shipping lanes that kept Britain alive. The British response was immediate and desperate. They sent the HMS Hood, a ship known globally as the Mighty Hood. For 20 years, the Hood had been the symbol of British global power, the largest and most beautiful battlecruiser ever built. It was the pride of the empire. But when the two ships met in the Denmark Strait, the reality of modern war was revealed in a way that traumatized the world. The Bismarck fired a single calculated salvo. A shell plunged through the Hood's thin deck armor and detonated the aft magazine. In an explosion that rose hundreds of feet into the air, the pride of the Royal Navy was torn in half. It sank in 3 minutes. Out of a crew of 1,418 men, only 3 survived. When the news reached London, the Admiralty fell into a state of shocked silence. The Bismarck had just decapitated the British Navy in its first outing. Prime Minister Winston Churchill issued the most famous command in naval history: sink the Bismarck. But there was a problem. The Bismarck was fast. It was disappearing into the fog of the Atlantic, heading toward the safety of the French coast, where it would be protected by the Luftwaffe. The main British fleet was hundreds of miles behind, unable to catch up. The only ship in range to do anything was the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. But the Ark Royal didn't carry modern, sleek dive bombers or high-speed interceptors. Its hangars were filled with a machine that looked like a tragic mistake: the fairy Swordfish. To the men who flew them, it was known affectionately or mockingly as the Stringbag. If you stood next to a Swordfish in 1941, you wouldn't believe it was a weapon of war. It was a biplane, a design that was already obsolete by the mid-1930s. Its skeleton was made of duralumin and steel tubing, but its skin was not metal. It was Irish linen stretched tight and painted with layers of cellulose dope to make it airtight and waterproof. If you punched it, your hand would go through. Its engine was a Bristol Pegasus radial that produced a chugging, rhythmic drone, struggling to pull the plane through the air at a top speed of barely 138 miles per hour. With a heavy torpedo strapped to its belly, that speed dropped to 90 miles per hour. In an era where the German Messerschmitts were pushing 350 miles per hour, the Swordfish was a flying turtle. The cockpit was open to the elements. There was no heater, no pressurized cabin, no canopy. The 3-man crew, pilot, observer, and telegraphist, sat in a line, exposed to the sub-zero winds of the North Atlantic. They had to wear heavy sheepskin-lined Irvin jackets and smear whale oil on their faces to prevent frostbite. Navigation was done by dead reckoning and handheld sextants, while the plane bounced violently in the gale-force winds. The torpedo they carried was the Mark 12, a 1,600-pound cylinder of TNT that had to be dropped from exactly the right height and the right speed, or it would simply shatter upon hitting the water or dive straight to the bottom. On the Bismarck, the 2,000 German sailors felt invincible. They had just sunk the hood. They had the most advanced radar-directed anti-aircraft guns in the world. They had the FUM-B-1 Metox radar warning receivers. Their gunners were the elite of the Kriegsmarine, trained to track and destroy targets moving at high speeds using sophisticated tachometric computers that predicted exactly where a plane would be based on its velocity and trajectory. To them, the British Stringbags were not a threat. They were target practice. They were relics from a forgotten age of wood and wire, trying to challenge a god of steel. But as the Ark Royal turned into the wind to launch its planes into a Force 8 gale, the British pilots knew something the Germans didn't. They knew their planes were so slow they could fly in weather that would ground any modern aircraft. They knew their fabric wings could take hits that would shatter a metal fuselage, and they knew that the very high-tech systems the Germans relied on had a blind spot, a glitch in the matrix of modern warfare. The stage was set for a confrontation that defied every rule of military science. It was 1914 versus 1941. It was canvas versus Krupp steel. It was a battle between a ship that couldn't be sunk and a plane that shouldn't have been flying. And as the first Swordfish wobbled off the pitching flight deck and vanished into the black storm clouds, the fate of the Second World War rested on a handful of men in a wooden kite. As the squadron of ferry Swordfish droned toward the Bismarck, they weren't just flying across the ocean, they were flying into a technical paradox. On the deck of the German battleship, the air defense crews were the most highly trained in the world. They were equipped with the FUMO-23 radar sets and the high-tech wackeltop or wobbling pot stabilized gun mounts. These were masterpieces of 1940s analog computing. The German anti-aircraft system worked on a principle called tachymetric fire control. Essentially, the gunners didn't aim at the plane, they aimed at where the plane was going to be. The computers took in the plane's speed, its altitude, and its trajectory, then calculated a lead and automatically set the fuses of the shells to explode at the exact microsecond they reached that predicted point in space. But there was a catastrophic error in the German software. It was too advanced. The German engineers had designed their fire control systems to defend against the future, against the fast 250-mile-per-hour metal monoplanes of the RAF Bomber Command. When the Swordfish appeared on their rangefinders, moving at a pathetic 85 to 90 miles per hour, the German computers choked. Because the Swordfish was flying slower than the minimum speed the computers were calibrated for, the math broke. The guns were automatically leading the planes by hundreds of yards. The German gunners were watching their shells explode in beautiful, terrifying clouds of black smoke, but they were exploding in empty air, far ahead of the lumbering biplanes. The Swordfish was so slow that it was effectively invisible to the brain of the Bismarck's defense system. This was the first glitch, but it wasn't the only one. Physics itself seemed to be protecting the wooden kites. The Bismarck's heavy secondary armament, the 15-centimeter guns, were designed to shred destroyers and heavy bombers. However, because the Swordfish were flying so low, barely 50 feet above the cresting Atlantic waves to stay under the radar, the Bismarck's gunners couldn't tilt their massive barrels down far enough. The physical structure of the ship's own hull blocked the guns from hitting targets that close and that low. The German sailors were forced to use their infantry machine guns and 20-millimeter flak cannons, but even here, the Stringbag had a supernatural advantage.
In a modern all-metal plane, a hit from a 20mm explosive shell is a death sentence. The shell hits the aluminum skin, triggers a fuse, and explodes inside the wing, shredding the fuel lines and the pilot. But the Swordfish was a ghost. Its wings were made of linen fabric. When the German shells hit the Swordfish, they didn't encounter enough resistance to trigger the impact fuses. The shells simply passed through the fabric wings like a needle through a shirt, leaving a neat, tiny hole and exploding harmlessly in the ocean on the other side. There are stories of Swordfish returning to the Ark Royal with over 200 holes in their wings, their pilots completely unaware they had even been hit, because the air just whistled through the gaps. As the planes drew closer, the German commander, Captain Ernst Lindemann, realized his high-tech guns were failing. He ordered his main 15-inch batteries, the same guns that had vaporized the HMS Hood, to fire into the ocean. It was a move of pure desperation. He wasn't trying to hit the planes, he was trying to create waterspouts. He hoped that the massive geysers of water created by the 1,700-pound shells would swamp the biplanes or tear their wooden wings off. The ocean surface became a chaotic forest of water pillars, some rising 200 feet into the air. The Swordfish pilots were flying through a literal apocalypse, blinded by salt spray, their engines coughing as they sucked in seawater, but they kept coming. The physics glitch wasn't just in the planes, it was in the torpedoes. The British had originally equipped the Swordfish with the latest magnetic duplex detonators. These were high-tech sensors designed to explode underneath the ship's hull, using the water's pressure to snap the keel. But in the violent Force 8 gale of the North Atlantic, the magnetic sensors were being triggered by the waves themselves. The first wave of torpedoes exploded prematurely, hundreds of yards away from the Bismarck. To any other military, this would have been a failure, but the British pilots made a low-tech pivot. They returned to the carrier, landed on a deck that was pitching like a seesaw, and told the deck crews to strip the tech. They swapped the magnetic fuses for old-fashioned contact detonators, simple triggers that only exploded when they slammed into steel. The battle had become a war of philosophies. The Germans were relying on complex, fragile, high-speed perfection. The British were leaning into slow, rugged, obsolete simplicity. As the sun began to set over the churning Atlantic, the Bismarck's crew was exhausted. They had fired thousands of rounds of ammunition, used the most expensive computers ever built, and yet the wooden ghosts were still circling in the mist. The Germans thought they were fighting a naval battle, but they were actually caught in a glitch of history. They were about to find out that a single 1914-style torpedo, delivered by a pilot who could barely see through his frozen goggles, was worth more than all the Krupp steel in the world. The golden shot was coming, and the world's most advanced battleship had no way to calculate its arrival.
The sun was dropping below the jagged horizon of the Atlantic, casting long, bloody shadows across the whitecaps of a Force 8 gale. On the bridge of the Bismarck, the mood had shifted from arrogant confidence to a cold, gnawing dread. They had survived the first wave, but they knew the British were relentless. The HMS Ark Royal was now pushing its flight deck to the absolute limit of physics. The ship was pitching so violently that its bow was burying itself in the swells, sending walls of green water crashing over the flight deck. In these conditions, no modern aircraft could take off. But the Swordfish, with its massive wingspan and low stall speed, was a kite that thrived in the wind. The pilots of 818 Naval Air Squadron climbed back into their open cockpits, their sheepskin suits heavy with salt and frozen spray, and roared into the darkening sky for the final, desperate strike. This was the moment of the golden shot. 15 Swordfish, led by Lieutenant Commander John Eugene Esmond, split into subflights to attack from different angles. This was a classic hammer and anvil tactic designed to overwhelm the Bismarck's steering.
As the planes descended through the clouds, they found themselves in a nightmare of tracer fire. The Bismarck was a ring of fire. Every gun, from the 20mm flaks to the 15-inch mains, was screaming into the dark. The pilots couldn't communicate by radio. The noise of the wind and the anti-aircraft fire was too deafening. They relied on hand signals and pure instinct, diving until they were so low that the spray from the Bismarck's bow was splashing against their landing gear. The first few torpedoes were misses or duds. The Bismarck, despite its size, was surprisingly agile, swinging its massive stern away from the incoming tracks. The German crew began to think they had done it. They were only hours away from the protective umbrella of the Luftwaffe in occupied France. If they could just hold out until dawn, they would be safe. But then the glitch happened. One lone Swordfish, piloted by John Jock Moffat, was coming in from the port quarter. Moffat was flying so low he was practically skimming the troughs of the waves. He waited until he was less than 2,000 yards away, point-blank range, and pulled the release wire. The torpedo, a Mark 12 contact-fused slug of TNT, slapped into the water and began its run. On the Bismarck, the lookout spotted the wake. The captain ordered a hard turn to evade, but the ship was too massive to move in time. The torpedo didn't hit the belt, the thickest part of the Bismarck's armor that could have shrugged off the explosion. Instead, it hit the Achilles heel. It slammed into the very rear of the ship, directly into the steering compartment. The explosion was catastrophic, but not in the way you'd think. It didn't sink the ship. It didn't even cause a major fire. Instead, the force of the blast jammed the Bismarck's massive twin rudders at a 12-degree turn to the left. The explosion had shattered the coupling of the steering gear and flooded the compartment with freezing seawater. Divers were sent down into the dark, flooded bowels of the ship to try and manually decouple the rudders, but the pressure of the water and the swaying of the ship made it an impossible task. They even considered using explosives to blow their own rudders off to steer with their propellers, but the risk of destroying the propellers themselves was too high. The unsinkable Bismarck was now a prisoner of its own momentum. It was trapped in a permanent, agonizing circle. Every time the engines pushed forward, the ship simply curved back toward the north. The German sailors watched their compasses in horror as the needle spun. They weren't heading for France anymore. They were sailing directly back into the arms of the British home fleet. Admiral Lütjens, the commander of the German task force, sent a final haunting radio message to Berlin. "Ship unmaneuverable. We shall fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." The most powerful battleship on Earth had been neutralized by a single 18-inch torpedo delivered by a wooden plane that cost less than the Bismarck's silverware. The golden shot had proven that no matter how thick the armor or how advanced the computer, a single mechanical glitch can turn a fortress into a coffin. As the moon rose, the British battleships King George V and Rodney were closing in, their 16-inch guns loaded and ready. The Bismarck was still floating, its guns were still hot, but it was a ghost ship waiting for the end in a cold, lonely circle in the middle of the Atlantic.
As the morning sun rose on May 27, 1941, it revealed a scene of mechanical tragedy. The Bismarck, a ship designed to conquer the world, was a paralyzed giant. Because of a single torpedo from a cloth plane, the ship was forced to steer into its own executioners. The British battleships King George V and Rodney closed in and unleashed a 3-hour storm of steel, firing nearly 3,000 shells until the pride of Germany was a burning, silent wreck. At 10:39 a.m., the Bismarck disappeared beneath the waves, taking over 2,000 men with it. The irony of this victory is one of the greatest in military history.
The German High Command had spent millions on Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, and complex fire control computers. They believed that superior technology would always defeat a numerically superior foe. But they were defeated by a stringbag. The fairy Swordfish proved that in the chaos of war, over-engineering is a liability. A plane so slow that computers couldn't track it, and so fragile that shells passed through it without exploding, had achieved what the world's most modern battleships could not. The Swordfish didn't just retire after the Bismarck, it stayed in the fight. It went on to cripple the Italian fleet at Taranto and protected Allied convoys until the very end of the war in 1945. It actually outlasted the faster metal planes that were supposed to replace it, because none of them could land as safely on a pitching deck in a storm. The story of the Swordfish versus the Bismarck serves as a permanent reminder. War isn't always won by the most advanced machine. It is won by the machine that is just good enough to exploit a glitch in the enemy's perfection. The canvas Kite proved that a 1914 idea could still kill a 1941 god, as long as it had the right pilot and a little bit of physics on its side.